Chapter 14, On Sunday when the church bells ring. Heidi was standing under the swaying fir trees, waiting for her grandfather to join her. He had promised to bring up her trunk from the village while she went in to visit the grandmother. The child was longing to see the blind woman again and to hear how she had liked the rolls. It was Saturday, and the grandfather had been cleaning the cottage. Soon he was ready to start. When they had descended and Heidi entered Peter's hut, the grandmother called lovingly to her, "Have you come again, child?" She took hold of Heidi's hand and held it tight. Grandmother then told the little visitor how good the rolls had tasted, and how much stronger she felt already. Brigitte related further that the grandmother had only eaten a single roll, being so afraid to finish them too soon. Heidi had listened attentively, and said, "Now, grandmother, I know what I shall do. I am going to write to Clara, and she'll surely send me a whole lot more." But Brigitte remarked, "That is meant well, but they get hard so soon. If I only had a few extra pennies, I could buy some from our baker. He makes them too, but I am hardly able to pay for the black bread." Heidi's face suddenly shone. "Oh, grandmother, I have an awful lot of money," she cried. "Now I know what I'll do with it. Every day you must have a fresh roll and 2 on Sundays. Peter can bring them up from the village." "No, no, child," the grandmother implored. "That must not be. You must give it to grandfather and he'll tell you what to do with it." But Heidi did not listen but jumped gaily about the little room, calling over and over again, "Now grandmother can have a roll every day. She'll get well and strong, and," she called with fresh delight, "maybe your eyes will see again, too, when you are strong and well." The grandmother remained silent, not to mar the happiness of the child. Seeing the old hymn book on the shelf, Heidi said, "Grandmother, shall I read you a song from your book now? I can read quite nicely," she added after a pause. "Oh yes, I wish you would, child. Can you really read?" Heidi, climbing on a chair, took down the dusty book from a shelf. After she had carefully wiped it off, she sat down on a stool. "What shall I read, grandmother?" "Whatever you want to," was the reply. Turning the pages, Heidi found a song about the sun, and decided to read that aloud. More and more eagerly she read, while the grandmother, with folded arms, sat in her chair. An expression of indescribable happiness shone in her countenance, though tears were rolling down her cheeks. When Heidi had repeated the end of the song a number of times, the old woman exclaimed, "Oh, Heidi, everything seems bright to me again and my heart is light. Thank you, child, you have done me so much good." Heidi looked enraptured at the grandmother's face, which had changed from an old, sorrowful expression to a joyous one. She seemed to look up gratefully, as if she could already behold the lovely, celestial gardens told of in the hymn. Soon the grandfather knocked on the window, for it was time to go. Heidi followed quickly, assuring the grandmother that she would visit her every day now. On the days she went up to the pasture with Peter, she would return in the early afternoon, for she did not want to miss the chance to make the grandmother's heart joyful and light. Brigitte urged Heidi to take her dress along, and with it on her arm the child joined the old man and immediately told him what had happened. On hearing of her plan to purchase rolls for the grandmother every day, the grandfather reluctantly consented. At this the child gave a bound, shouting, "Oh grandfather, now grandmother won't ever have to eat hard, black bread anymore. Oh, everything is so wonderful now. If God our Father had done immediately what I prayed for, I should have come home at once and could not have brought half as many rolls to grandmother. I should not have been able to read either. Grandmama told me that God would make everything much better than I could ever dream. I shall always pray from now on, the way Grandmama taught me. When God does not give me something I pray for, I shall always remember how everything has worked out for the best this time. We'll pray every day, grandfather, won't we? For otherwise God might forget us. And if somebody should forget to do it, murmured the old man. Oh, he'll get on badly, for God will forget him, too. If he is unhappy and wretched, people don't pity him, for they will say, he went away from God, and now the Lord, who alone can help him, has no pity on him. Is that true, Heidi? Who told you so? Grandmama explained it all to me. After a pause, the grandfather said, "Yes, but if it has happened, then there is no help. Nobody can come back to the Lord, when God has once forgotten him." But grandfather, everybody can come back to him, grandmama told me that, and besides there is the beautiful story in my book. Oh, grandfather, you don't know it yet, and I shall read it to you as soon as we get home. The grandfather had brought a big basket with him, in which he carried half the contents of Heidi's trunk. It had been too large to be conveyed up the steep ascent. Arriving at the hut and setting down his load, he had to sit beside Heidi, who was ready to begin the tale. With great animation, Heidi read the story of the prodigal son, who was happy at home with his father's cows and sheep. The picture showed him leaning on his staff, watching the sunset. Suddenly, he wanted to have his own inheritance, and be able to be his own master. Demanding the money from his father, he went away and squandered all. Often he would think what a good home he had left, and when he remembered how good his father had been to him and his own ungratefulness, he would cry from repentance and longing. Then he said to himself, "I shall go to my father and ask his forgiveness." When he approached his former home, his father came out to meet him. "What do you think will happen now?" Heidi asked. "You think that the father is angry and will say, 'Didn't I tell you?' But just listen." And his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck. And the son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry, for this my son was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found." And they began to be merry. "Isn't it a beautiful story, grandfather?" asked Heidi, when he sat silently beside her. "Yes, Heidi, it is," said the grandfather, but so seriously that Heidi quietly looked at the pictures. Look how happy he is, she said, pointing to it. A few hours later, when Heidi was sleeping soundly, the old man climbed up the ladder. Placing a little lamp beside the sleeping child, he watched her a long, long time. Her little hands were folded and her rosy face looked confident and peaceful. The old man now folded his hands and said in a low voice, while big tears rolled down his cheeks, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and thee, and am no more worthy to be thy son." The next morning found the uncle standing before the door, looking about him over valley and mountain. A few early bells sounded from below and the birds sang their morning anthems. Re-entering the house, he called, "Heidi, get up. The sun is shining. Put on a pretty dress, for we are going to church." That was a new call, and Heidi obeyed quickly. When the child came downstairs in her smart little frock, she opened her eyes wide. "Oh, grandfather," she exclaimed, "I have never seen you in your Sunday coat with the silver buttons. Oh, how fine you look." The old man, turning to the child, said with a smile, "You look nice, too, come now." With Heidi's hand in his, they wandered down together. The nearer they came to the village, the louder and richer the bells resounded. "Oh, grandfather, do you hear it? It seems like a big, high feast," said Heidi. When they entered the church, all the people were singing. Though they sat down on the last bench behind, the people had noticed their presence and whispered it from ear to ear. When the pastor began to preach, his words were a loud thanksgiving that moved all his hearers. After the service, the old man and the child walked to the parsonage. The clergyman had opened the door and received them with friendly words. "I have come to ask your forgiveness for my harsh words," said the uncle. "I want to follow your advice to spend the winter here among you. If the people look at me askance, I can't expect any better. I am sure, Mr. Pastor, you will not do so." The pastor's friendly eyes sparkled, and with many a kind word he commended the uncle for this change, and putting his hand on Heidi's curly hair, ushered them out. Thus the people, who had been all talking together about this great event, could see that their clergyman shook hands with the old man. The door of the parsonage was hardly shut, when the whole assembly came forward with outstretched hands and friendly greetings. Great seemed to be their joy at the old man's resolution. Some of the people even accompanied him on his homeward way. When they had parted at last, the uncle looked after them with his face shining as with an inward light. Heidi looked up to him and said, "Grandfather, you have never looked so beautiful." "Do you think so, child?" he said with a smile. "You see, Heidi, I am more happy than I deserve. To be at peace with God and men makes one's heart feel light. God has been good to me, to send you back." When they arrived at Peter's hut, the grandfather opened the door and entered. "How do you do, grandmother?" he called out. "I think we must start to mend again, before the fall wind comes." "Oh my God, the uncle!" exclaimed the grandmother in joyous surprise. "How happy I am to be able to thank you for what you have done, uncle." "Thank you. God bless you for it." With trembling joy, the grandmother shook hands with her old friend. "There is something else I want to say to you, uncle," she continued. "If I have ever hurt you in any way, do not punish me. Do not let Heidi go away again before I die. I cannot tell you what Heidi means to me." So saying, she held the clinging child to her. "No danger of that, grandmother. I hope we shall all stay together now, for many years to come." Brigida now showed Heidi's feather hat to the old man and asked him to take it back. But the uncle asked her to keep it, since Heidi had given it to her. "What blessings this child has brought from Frankfurt," Brigida said. "I often wondered if I should not send our little Peter too. What do you think, uncle?" The uncle's eyes sparkled with fun when he replied, "I am sure it would not hurt Peter. Nevertheless, I should wait for a fitting occasion before I sent him." The next moment Peter himself arrived in great haste. He had a letter for Heidi, which had been given to him in the village. What an event! A letter for Heidi. They all sat down at the table while the child read it aloud. The letter was from Clara Seaman, who wrote that everything had got so dull since Heidi left. She said that she could not stand it very long, and therefore her father had promised to take her to Raggett's this coming fall. She announced that Grandmama was coming too, for she wanted to see Heidi and her grandfather. Grandmama, having heard about the rolls, was sending some coffee, too, so that the grandmother would not have to eat them dry. Grandmama also insisted on being taken to the grandmother herself when she came on her visit. Great was the delight caused by this news, and what with all the questions and plans that followed, the grandfather himself forgot how late it was. This happy day, which had united them all, caused the old woman to say at parting, "The most beautiful thing of all, though, is to be able to shake hands again with an old friend, as in days gone by. It is a great comfort to find again what we have treasured. I hope you'll come soon again, uncle. I am counting on the child for tomorrow." This promise was given. While Heidi and her grandfather were on their homeward path, the peaceful sound of evening bells accompanied them. At last they reached the cottage, which seemed to glow in the evening light. Chapter 15: Preparations for a Journey. The kind doctor who had sent Heidi home to her beloved mountains was approaching the Seaman residence on a sunny day in September. Everything about him was bright and cheerful, but the doctor did not even raise his eyes from the pavement to the blue sky above. His face was sad and his hair had turned very gray since spring. A few months ago, the doctor had lost his only daughter, who had lived with him since his wife's early death. The blooming girl had been his only joy, and since she had gone from him the ever-cheerful doctor was bowed down with grief. When Sebastian opened the door to the physician, he bowed very low, for the doctor made friends wherever he went. "I am glad you have come, doctor," Mr. Seaman called to his friend as he entered. "Please let us talk over this trip to Switzerland again. Do you still give the same advice, now that Clara is so much better?" "What must I think of you, Seaman?" replied the doctor, sitting down. "I wish your mother was here. Everything is clear to her and things go smoothly then. This is the third time today that you have called me, and always for the same thing." "It is true, it must make you impatient," said Mr. Seaman. Laying his hand on his friend's shoulder, he continued, "I cannot say how hard it is for me to refuse Clara this trip. Haven't I promised it to her, and hasn't she looked forward to it for months? She has borne all her suffering so patiently, just because she had hoped to be able to visit her little friend on the Alp. I hate to rob her of this pleasure. The poor child has so many trials and so little change. But, Cece man, you must do it, was the doctor's answer. When his friend remained silent, he continued, just think what a hard summer Clara has had. She never was more ill, and we could not attempt this journey without risking the worst consequences. Remember, we are in September now, and though the weather may still be fine on the Alp, it is sure to be very cool. The days are getting short, and she could only spend a few hours up there, if she had to return for the night. It would take several hours to have her carried up from Raggets. You see yourself how impossible it is. I shall come in with you, though, to talk to Clara, and you'll find her sensible. I'll tell you of my plan for next May. First, she can go to Raggets to take the baths. She'll be stronger then and much more able to enjoy those excursions than she is now. If we hope for an improvement in her condition, we must be extremely cautious and careful, remember that. Mr. Cece-man, who had been listening with the utmost submission, now said anxiously, Doctor, please tell me honestly if you still have hope left for any change? With shrugging shoulders, the doctor replied, not very much. But think of me, Cece-man. Have you not a child, who loves you and always welcomes you? You don't have to come back to a lonely house and sit down alone at your table. Your child is well taken care of, and if she has many privations, she also has many advantages. Cece-man, you do not need to be pitied. Just think of my lonely home. Mr. Cece-man had gotten up and was walking round the room, as he always did when something occupied his thoughts. Suddenly he stood before his friend and said, Doctor, I have an idea. I cannot see you sad any longer. You must get away. You shall undertake this trip and visit Heidi in our stead. Chapter 14, On Sunday when the church bells ring. The doctor had been surprised by this proposal, and tried to object. But Mr. Cece-man was so full of his new project that he pulled his friend with him into his daughter's room, not leaving him time for any remonstrances. Clara loved the doctor, who had always tried to cheer her up on his visits by bright and funny tales. She was sorry for the change that had come over him and would have given much to see him happy again. When he had shaken hands with her, both men pulled up their chairs to Clara's bedside. Mr. Cece-man began to speak of their journey and how sorry he was to give it up. Then he quickly began to talk of his new plan. Clara's eyes had filled with tears. But she knew that her father did not like to see her cry, and besides she was sure that her papa would only forbid her this pleasure because it was absolutely necessary to do so. So she bravely fought her tears, and caressing the doctor's hand, said, Oh please, doctor, do go to Heidi, then you can tell me all about her, and can describe her grandfather to me, and Peter, with his goats, I seem to know them all so well. Then you can take all the things to her that I had planned to take myself. Oh, please doctor, go, and then I'll be good and take as much cod liver oil as ever you want me to. Who can tell if this promise decided the doctor? At any rate, he answered with a smile, Then I surely must go, Clara, for you will get fat and strong, as we both want to see you. Have you settled yet when I must go? Oh, you had better go tomorrow morning, doctor, Clara urged. She is right, the father assented, the sun is shining and you must not lose any more glorious days on the Alp. The doctor had to laugh. Why don't you chide me for being here still? I shall go as quickly as I can, Cece man. Clara gave many messages to him for Heidi. She also told him to be sure to observe everything closely, so that he would be able to tell her all about it when he came back. The things for Heidi were to be sent to him later, for Miss Rottenmeier, who had to pack them, was out on one of her lengthy wanderings about town. The doctor promised to comply with all Clara's wishes and to start the following day. Clara rang for the maid and said to her, when she arrived, "Please, Tinette, pack a lot of fresh, soft coffee cake in this box." A box had been ready for this purpose many days. When the maid was leaving the room she murmured, "That's a silly bother." Sebastian, who had happened to overhear some remarks, asked the physician when he was leaving to take his regards to the little miss, as he called Heidi. With a promise to deliver this message, the doctor was just hastening out, when he encountered an obstacle. Miss Rottenmeier, who had been obliged to return from her walk on account of the strong wind, was just coming in. She wore a large cape, which the wind was blowing about her like two full sails. Both had retreated politely to give way to each other. Suddenly the wind seemed to carry the housekeeper straight towards the doctor, who had barely time to avoid her. This little incident, which had ruffled Miss Rottenmeier's temper very much, gave the doctor occasion to soothe her, as she liked to be soothed by this man, whom she respected more than anybody in the world. Telling her of his intended visit, he entreated her to pack the things for Heidi as only she knew how. Clara had expected some resistance from Miss Rottenmeier about the packing of her presents. What was her surprise when this lady showed herself most obliging, and immediately, on being told, brought together all the articles. First came a heavy coat for Heidi, with a hood, which Clara meant her to use on visits to the grandmother in the winter. Then came a thick warm shawl and a large box with coffee cake for the grandmother. An enormous sausage for Peter's mother followed, and a little sack of tobacco for the grandfather. At last a lot of mysterious little parcels and boxes were packed, things that Clara had gathered together for Heidi. When the tidy pack lay ready on the ground, Clara's heart filled with pleasure at the thought of her little friend's delight. Sebastian now entered, and putting the pack on his shoulder, carried it to the doctor's house without delay. Chapter 16: A Guest on the Alp. The early dawn was tingeing the mountains and a fresh morning breeze rocked the old fir trees to and fro. Heidi opened her eyes, for the rustling of the wind had awakened her. These sounds always thrilled her heart, and now they drew her out of bed. Rising hurriedly, she soon was neatly dressed and combed. Coming down the little ladder and finding the grandfather's bed empty, she ran outside. The old man was looking up at the sky to see what the weather was going to be like that day. Rosy clouds were passing overhead, but gradually the sky grew more blue and deep, and soon a golden light passed over the heights, for the sun was rising in all his glory. Oh, how lovely! Good morning, grandfather, Heidi exclaimed. Are your eyes bright already? The grandfather retorted, holding out his hand. Heidi then ran over to her beloved fir trees and danced about, while the wind was howling in the branches. After the old man had washed and milked the goats, he brought them out of the shed. When Heidi saw her friends again, she caressed them tenderly, and they in their turn nearly crushed her between them. Sometimes when Barley got too wild, Heidi would say, "But Barley, you pushed me like the big Turk," and that was enough to quiet the goat. Soon Peter arrived with the whole herd, the jolly thistlefinch ahead of all the others. Heidi, being soon in the midst of them, was pushed about among them. Peter was anxious to say a word to the little girl, so he gave a shrill whistle, urging the goats to climb ahead. When he was near her, he said reproachfully, "You really might come with me today." "No, I can't, Peter," said Heidi. "They might come from Frankfurt any time. I must be home when they come." "How often you have said that," grumbled the boy. "But I mean it," replied Heidi. "Do you really think I want to be away when they come from Frankfurt? Do you really think that, Peter?" "They could come to Uncle," Peter growled. Then the grandfather's strong voice was heard. "Why doesn't the army go forward? Is it the field marshal's fault, or the fault of the troop?" Peter immediately turned about and led his goats up the mountain without more ado. Since Heidi had come home again to her grandfather, she did many things that had never occurred to her before. For instance, she would make her bed every morning, and run about the hut, tidying and dusting. With an old rag she would rub the chairs and table till they all shone, and the grandfather would exclaim, "It is always Sunday with us now. Heidi has not been away in vain." On this day after breakfast, when Heidi began her self-imposed task, it took her longer than usual, for the weather was too glorious to stay within. Over and over again a bright sunbeam would tempt the busy child outside. How could she stay indoors, when the glistening sunshine was pouring down and all the mountains seemed to glow? She had to sit down on the dry, hard ground and look down into the valley and all about her. Then, suddenly remembering her little duties, she would hasten back. It was not long, though, till the roaring fir trees tempted her again. The grandfather had been busy in his little shop, merely glancing over at the child from time to time. Suddenly he heard her call, "Oh, grandfather, come." He was frightened and came out quickly. He saw her running down the hill crying, "They are coming, they are coming. Oh, the doctor is coming first." When Heidi at last reached her old friend, he held out his hand, which Heidi immediately seized. In the full joy of her heart, she exclaimed, "How do you do, doctor? And I thank you 1,000 times." "How are you, Heidi?" "But what are you thanking me for already?" the doctor asked, with a smile. "Because you let me come home again," the child explained. The gentleman's face lit up like sunshine. He had certainly not counted on such a reception on the Alp. On the contrary, not even noticing all the beauty around him, he had climbed up sadly for he was sure that Heidi probably would not know him anymore. He thought that he would be far from welcome, being obliged to cause her a great disappointment. Instead, he beheld Heidi's bright eyes looking up at him in gratefulness and love. She was still holding his arm when he said, "Come now, Heidi, and take me to your grandfather, for I want to see where you live." Like a kind father, he had taken her hand, but Heidi stood still and looked down the mountainside. "But where are Clara and Grandmama?" she asked. "Child, I must tell you something now which will grieve you as much as it grieves me," replied the doctor. "I had to come alone, for Clara has been very ill and could not travel. Of course Grandmama has not come either, but the spring will soon be here, and when the days get long and warm, they will surely visit you." Heidi was perfectly amazed. She could not understand how all those things that she had pictured to herself so clearly would not happen after all. She was standing perfectly motionless, confused by the blow. It was some time before Heidi remembered that, after all, she had come down to meet the doctor. Looking up at her friend, she was struck by his sad and cheerless face. How changed he was since she had seen him. She did not like to see people unhappy, least of all the good, kind doctor. He must be sad because Clara and Grandmama had not come, and to console him she said, "Oh, it won't last long till spring comes again, then they will come for sure, they'll be able to stay much longer then, and that will please Clara. Now we'll go to Grandfather." Hand in hand she climbed up with her old friend. All the way she tried to cheer him up by telling him again and again of the coming summer days. After they had reached the cottage, she called out to her grandfather, quite happily. "They are not here yet, but it won't be very long before they are coming." The grandfather warmly welcomed his guest, who did not seem at all a stranger, for had not Heidi told him many things about the doctor? They all three sat down on the bench before the door, and the doctor told of the object of his visit. He whispered to the child that something was coming up the mountain very soon which would bring her more pleasure than his visit. What could it be? The uncle advised the doctor to spend the splendid days of autumn on the Alp, if possible, and to take a little room in the village instead of in Raggetts. Then he could easily walk up every day to the hut, and from there the uncle could take him all around the mountains. This plan was accepted. The sun was in its zenith and the wind had ceased. Only a soft, delicious breeze fanned the cheeks of all. The uncle now got up and went into the hut, returning soon with the table and their dinner. "Go in, Heidi, and set the table here. I hope you will excuse our simple meal," he said, turning to his guest. "I shall gladly accept this delightful invitation. I am sure that dinner will taste good up here," said the guest, looking down over the sunbathed valley. Heidi was running to and fro, for it gave her great joy to be able to wait on her kind protector. Soon the uncle appeared with the steaming milk, the toasted cheese, and the finely sliced, rosy meat that had been dried in the pure air. The doctor enjoyed his dinner better than any he had ever tasted. "Yes, we must send Clara up here. How she could gather strength," he said, "if she would have an appetite like mine today, she couldn't help getting nice and fat." At this moment, a man could be seen walking up with a large sack on his shoulders. Arriving on top, he threw down his load, breathing in the pure, fresh air. Opening the cover, the doctor said, "This has come for you from Frankfurt, Heidi. Come and look what is in it." Heidi timidly watched the heap, and only when the gentleman opened the box with the cakes for the grandmother she said joyfully, "Oh, now grandmother can eat this lovely cake." She was taking the box and the beautiful shawl on her arm and was going to race down to deliver the gifts, when the men persuaded her to stay and unpack the rest. What was her delight at finding the tobacco and all the other things. The men had been talking together, when the child suddenly planted herself in front of them and said, "These things have not given me as much pleasure as the dear doctor's coming." Both men smiled. When it was near sunset, the doctor rose to start on his way down. The grandfather, carrying the box, the shawl and the sausage, and the guest holding the little girl by the hand, they wandered down the mountainside. When they reached Peter's hut, Heidi was told to go inside and wait for her grandfather there. At parting she asked, "Would you like to come with me up to the pasture tomorrow, doctor?" "With pleasure." "Goodbye, Heidi," was the reply. The grandfather had deposited all the presents before the door, and it took Heidi long to carry in the huge box and the sausage. The shawl she put on the grandmother's knee. Brigida had silently watched the proceedings, and could not open her eyes wide enough when she saw the enormous sausage. Never in her life had she seen the like, and now she really possessed it and could cut it herself. "Oh, grandmother, don't the cakes please you awfully? Just look how soft they are," the child exclaimed. What was her amazement when she saw the grandmother more pleased with the shawl, which would keep her warm in winter. "Grandmother, Clara has sent you that," Heidi said. "Oh, what kind good people they are to think of a poor old woman like me. I never thought I should ever own such a splendid wrap." At this moment, Peter came stumbling in. "The uncle is coming up behind me," and Heidi must, that was as far as he got, for his eyes had fastened on the sausage. Heidi, however, had already said goodbye, for she knew what he had meant. Though her uncle never went by the hut any more without stepping in, she knew it was too late today. "Heidi, come, you must get your sleep," he called through the open door. Bidding them all good night, he took Heidi by the hand and under the glistening stars they wandered home to their peaceful cottage.